new to that, certainly not after Sebastian's talk. That's the advantage of working in the same department and not having time to speak to each other before the conference. But while working on this presentation, I actually realized that I've never worked on Bantu grammar from a Bantu-wide perspective. So I've mainly done lexical reconstructive work, lexical reconstruction work from a Bantu-wide perspective, and over the past years I got a bit swamped into the lower sub-branches of Bantu, mainly the Kikongo language cluster and west coast of Bantu. So I tend to have a perspective from below and not so much a bird's eye view on Bantu grammar. But still, from the recent research we have been doing on complex verbal derivation suffixes, I would like to draw some, or try to draw some conclusions on Proto-Bantu grammar. So Mason in his, this is the list of suffixes reconstructed by Mason. So he reconstructs 7 verbal derivation suffixes with VC shape and 2 with a V shape, as has been discussed in earlier talks today. But no polysyllabic suffixes having a non-compositional meaning. I will explain later on what I understand by this. He says a verbal base can have more than one suffix, but such suffix sequences are difficult to illustrate with reconstructed bases since these forms are productive and highly unstable. Some characteristics of suffix sequences can, however, be given. Ik, am, at would occupy first position, I and U have last position, even after pre-final, and U absolute last even after I. A tentative and probably too strict order of succession is the following: at, amik, uduk, an, it, I and U. So we already see here a preliminary version of the CARP template reconstructed or proposed by Larry for Proto-Bantu on very conclusive evidence from Shona, Makua, and Chichewa. I'm teasing you, Larry. So he proposed that suffixes in Proto-Bantu or in Pan-Bantu, Cross-Bantu appear in this causative, applicative, reciprocal, and passive order. So he proposes this ordering of suffixes as competing with the so-called mirror principle, by which affix order would directly correlate with the order of syntactic operations. So the suffix furthest removed from the root has scope of the one closest to the root. For instance, an applicativized causative is to make cry, which is a causative with a stick. It's an applicativized causative versus a causativized applicative. Stir with a spoon, make someone stir with a spoon. So the applicative comes first and then the causative, at least semantically. So while templatic CARP order can either be mirroring, Larry calls this compositional and non-compositional, but I try to avoid these terms because I use them in another way. So this is mirroring. This actually reflects the semantics and syntactic operations, but the same order. Each il can be an applicativized causative or a causativized applicative in Chichewa. While non-templatic orders do occur in Bantu and across Bantu, but they are always mirroring. So if they are occurring in the reverse order, they also always directly reflect syntactic orders. For instance, in Chichewa you can have a reciprocalized causative, mangit-san, as opposed to a causative reciprocal manganit. So manganit is in contrast with the CARP order, but so it reflects the syntactic operations. Larry proposes an elaboration of this CARP template to CARCP, so with the short causative appearing in between the reciprocal and the passive. And he says this is a challenge to an assumedly non-arbitrary relation between morphology and syntax, or between morphology and semantics underlying suffix ordering in Bantu. Of course, the question is, if we reconstruct this template, and if, as some have proposed, this template would reflect the sequence or chronology of grammaticalization, the question is, to what node in the Bantu tree do we reconstruct this template? Jeff Good, in his 2005 study in Diachronica, has focused and there he on a much wider or broader Bantu sample, a subset of this card template, which he calls cut, instead of, so the short causative, he calls it transitive. And so he has a sample of 32 Bantu languages, including several from the northwestern Bantu. So not only Mason is always right, but also Larry is always right. So he confirms there with the evidence that in all this cat or suborder is attested in all surveyed languages, and only one productive order. So the applicative causative does not follow the pattern, but every language allowing applicative causative also allows causative applicative. So at least this part of the card is confirmed, or on the sample there is evidence for a Bantu-wide distribution, including Northwest Bantu. But still, so these suffix sequences dealt with by Jeff and Larry are still semantically composed. So even if Larry calls them non-compositional, if they don't agree with the mirroring principle, they still reflect causative and applicative, or causative and reciprocal. So you still see the individual contribution of each of the suffixes in the meaning of the derived verb stem. And so Mason, he does not reconstruct any of the semantically non-compositional suffix sequences, although many present-day Bantu languages do have such polysyllabic derivational suffixes. And they convey non-compositional meanings. That is meanings in which the separate contribution of each of the individual components is no longer identifiable, or not very straightforwardly like suffixes in the card template. And so mostly they are composed of suffixes which have been reconstructed to Proto-Bantu or to one higher level. For instance, one of these is agut or aguk, which is composed of the repetitive ag and either the separative transitive ut or separative transitive u. And it's the compound suffix commonly conveys a meaning that is actually more or less the same as the one reconstructed by Sebassoni for the first component ag. So he says the pre-final of the verb, Bantu verb, should be reconstructed as ag. It's in the same issue as Bantu grammatical reconstructions, with the meaning of duration, repetition, or continuity. And so this agut has more or less the same meaning. The contribution of the second element at most is limited to the distinction between transitive versus intransitive, but no separative meaning whatsoever. So several languages have only one of both compound suffixes, so showing a certain degree of independent development. So for instance, in many languages of southwestern Bantu having clicks, we find several verbs with clicks having one of these auk or aul suffixes and having cognates in other close related languages without so these Manual and Bengali have clicks in these verbs, while English doesn't have them. So there are no reconstructions in Bantu lexical reconstructions, and it's relatively widespread in parts of East and Southwest Bantu, but mainly in the western part of East Bantu and the easternmost languages of West Bantu. So it's probably a late innovation in East Bantu with possibly contact-induced spread into the easternmost Southwest Bantu languages. Hard to say, but certainly not reconstructible up to Proto-Bantu. So another suffix which has already been mentioned by Rosanne in her talk this morning is this passive suffix vowel ban in Bantu A7, which is clearly almost in its most complete form visible in Ewando and Bulu, and it's a passive suffix. And we see, if we compare the passive suffix in the A70 languages with the middle suffix, we see clear correspondences. So the first element seems to be that middle suffix. This suffix covers quite a big part in Fang, for instance, a big part of Kevin's semantic domain of the middle. So we could even call it a middle marker and not a plus middle. So the middle is the one Rosanne mentioned as being mentioned by Thilo. The general shape, it's this B, so appearing in Guthrie's zone A and B, reported in several northwestern Bantu languages. And Thilo himself said it cannot be, it should be distinct from the Proto-Bantu passive allomorph Ibu, as in certain present-day Bantu languages such as Bassa. Reflexes of both coexist. So he says this first element of this middle bit and the E of the passive cannot be the same. So if I go, I've checked Larry's description of Bassa, but I don't immediately see a reflex of Ibu or of Be in one of these both, but Tilo often sees things that I do not see, so I would not dare to contradict him, but I'm wondering if the first element of the long suffix Ibu, if that could not be the same middle suffix as appearing in many zone A languages. So if what you find as Ibu outside of Northwestern Bantu is not a compound of the middle suffix appearing in Northwestern Bantu plus the U suffix reconstructed by Bateson for Proto-Bantu. And so in that sense, Ibu could also be a non-compositional compound suffix in which the whole suffix has the same meaning or conveys the same meaning as one of its elements, as we see in Ban, for instance, or Agut elsewhere in Bantu. So the second historical component of Ban, it's An, obviously, about which Sebastian talked, and the semantic contribution of An in the emergence of the passive, the shift from middle to passive could be by the concept of co-participation. So while middle verbs typically stage one event or one participant events, passives involve at least implicitly two participants. So the An could have been added somehow to the middle to convey the idea that there are two participants in the event, a patient and an agent, which of course corresponds or ties in with the etymology of an. Schlatt and others have, after him, have assumed that and it was referred to by Sarah, I think, and also by Rosette, that so na, the commutative preposition na, is the assumed origin of an, and it's also the most, as Rosette has called, the most common introducer of agent phrases in Bantu passive construction. So you see here a link between the etymology, the origin, semantic origin of an and passive constructions. So from this observation in 870 that a compound suffix built on an and another suffix can convey a non-compositional meaning, we go to Daman, who he was not in the big four or five or how many, but he's also big. He published a lot, at least certainly about extensions, and he observed that an is very prolific across Bantu in compound extensions with non-compositional or idiosyncratic meanings. And these are reconstructions in Bantu lexical reconstructions, including such compound extensions, and you see a lot of them have angan, agan, so the ones on the right hand side, angan, agan, or the same akan, which is the same complex, or possibly instead of an, the same with another vowel than a, engan, ukan, ikan. So these are reconstructions, but as you all also see, and as we have noticed in our 2010 article, none of these double extension verbs is widespread throughout Bantu. They occur at most in three contiguous country zones, even if the actual distribution is underrated, and some zones are better represented than others in VLR3. This limited geographic spread suggests that they are of relatively recent origin. So these double extensions certainly do not go back to Proto-Bantu. And I thought, so that was my view in 2010. I thought I could change my view, but I also sometimes I'm right. So I'll try to show that I thought that they could, some of them could go back to Proto-Bantu, but actually they don't. But still, I'll show evidence to show that some of them are quite old within Bantu. So from recent research with Sebastian and Hayden on the Kikongo language cluster, we observed that within the Kikongo language cluster, there are generally two reciprocal markers, a short an and a complex one based on an. We propose that the complex in nowadays Kikongo languages is the prototypical reciprocal for use for prototypical reciprocal events, while an is actually, as Sebastian proposed, a lexicalized middle marker including naturally reciprocal events. So, for instance, in Chiwoyo, Kuni Jan, it's to plant for each other. It's a doubled infinitive doubling verb. So, while verbs like monan, it's to see each other, it's to meet. This is a natural, it's a lexicalized verb, naturally reciprocal verb. And this is the distribution. So this is the distribution of complex reciprocal markers in Kikongo language clusters. So we have a lot of, or I have a lot of reconstructing this. So what we propose is that you see that a lot of them have they have a voiced fricative. A lot of have unvoiced, but also some have a voiced fricative. So that's why we proposed at the origin. It's actually at the origin. It's a sequence, or if we express this in Proto-Bantu terms, it's a sequence of the applicative plus the short causative plus the reciprocal. Notice that this is in contradiction with the carved template, but probably what happens is that this ed, it is a non-compositional sequence of the applicative causative meaning causative, and that's what Bostoen Bostoen reconstructs apart from E and Ichi. She reconstructs a distinct non-causative suffix ed, whose reflexes generally have a voiced alveolar or palatal fricative. So, like in Swahili, you have ish s versus is es. Also in Schwabel, we have this opposition, and so Yvonne calls this a figement, a fixing of a sequence of suffixes comprising applicative e and the short causative e. She says it probably occurred independently in different parts of the Bantu domain, but if you see her map of the distribution of this suffix, it's mostly in the east, but also, the map is not very clear, but they're also at the stations in the northwest. So one can wonder if this ed causative, if it really does not go back to Proto-Bantu, so that you have maybe at least three types of causatives: e short, e, chi, and maybe ed. It's also, but only in a very limited way, tested on her map in the Kikongo language cluster. So what we proposed is that it's so that it was originally meaning reciprocity of causation, and then shifted to reciprocity only. So in some present-day languages like Ghent, you still have oppositions between anis, which is the mirroring. It's not following the carved template, and this is causation of reciprocity. So help to multiply, help to love each other, so that, and as opposed to reciprocity of causation, which is causative plus, so is an, goga san, make each other to speak, make each other to strike. So it's the mirroring principle. So our proposal is that this you have a generalization from reciprocity of causation to reciprocity, and that this in Proto-Kikongo, Ijan has become the general prototypical reciprocal marker, while An was already a lexicalized middle marker. So then we have left to right vowel copying. Ijan is Ajan, as in certain languages, Azan. You have Y absorption. This is a widely tested phonological change in Bantu, Azan, and that's part of the voicing, giving Asan in most Kikongo, present-day Kikongo varieties. So from this evidence, we would say, this goes back to Proto-Kikongo. Yeah, well, Proto-Kikongo, you will say we do not care. That's very recent, but still, we still assume that it's 2,000 to 2,500 years old. So it's more than 100 years at least. So does it go back to Proto-West Coastal Bantu, the immediate nodes above the Kikongo language cluster? Very difficult to say, because those languages, the B50 to 80 languages, retained very few derivational morphology, and due to minimality constraints, certainly not the longer ones, but I come back on that. So it's hard to know whether it's reconstructible to Proto-West Coastal Bantu, but we do find similar causative-based compound reciprocal suffixes widespread in Southwest Bantu, but also, for instance, in East Bantu, in Bangu Bangu. Leifson himself, in his 1954 grammar sketch, he says he gives Ijane, which is, in most examples, there was a longer suffix Ijane, of which the use and meaning could not be established with certainty, except that it goes together with the reflex objective yi to mark reciprocity. So this is reflexive-based reciprocity, but with a longer extension, including an. In Southwest Bantu, you have a lot of similar suffixes as in the Kikongo language cluster. Also, extensions including having voiced fricatives. So I assumed, Jan as well, I assumed that they had the same origin, so ed an, and that in the languages with voiceless fricative, the spiral devoicing took place. Unfortunately, I've checked on the basis of Janssen's article in Afrikanica Linguistica, but in Luchazi, Luvari, Kwanyama, Ndonga, and Herero, where you do have voiceless fricatives, spiral devoicing is not a common phenomenon. So if ed an would be the origin, you should have a voiced fricative in those extensions. So it's probably the case that complex causative-based reciprocal markers can have two distinct origins, ed an or ichi an, which is annoying if we want to reconstruct this back deep in time, because this means that they are probably are parallel innovations that occurred repeatedly within Bantu, within Western Bantu, so that at most we can reconstruct it in lower notes of the Bantu G. But also, for instance, in Central West Bantu, you have Ahan in Bolia, Ihan, where it's even no longer a reciprocal marker, but it's a lexicalized middle marker, showing that this well, not univerbation, but the fact that it's a non-compositional suffix, it's quite also, it's a further cycle in the evolution from productive reciprocal to a lexicalized middle marker, also in Mongo, Asan, and you even find it in some northwestern Bantu languages like Kudu, A11, Isan, but there it's still compositional or semi-compositional. You do still find, you see somehow, you still see causative semantics in these forms. So it's be deadly, so be curative, be quarrelsome. So it's causing, being in the state of causing something. So causative plus reciprocal sequences are widespread as extensions having a non-compositional meaning. They are attested in most major Bantu branches, but they can have two distinct origins. They convey meanings that belong to the wider domain, wider semantic domain of the middle, but semantically, so that the diachronic development mirrors quite closely that of an, so the simple answer. This is a next cycle of innovations, but they are probably the result of parallel innovation with at most reconstructibility to the most recent common ancestor of major sub-branches. So I looked at another candidate. I already showed Angan or Angan, so this is the frequentative plus reciprocal. It's also occurs in Southwest Bantu. The first component is Ang, which is an allomorph of Ak. Sebasori says Ak is predominantly found in the northeast and east of the Bantu domain, Ak in the north and Ang in the west and south. So he reconstructs Ak, Ang, and Ak as being allomorphs of the same suffix. Angan as a reciprocal marker is also widespread across East Bantu. I think Angan reciprocal marker can be reconstructed in the West Nyanza subgroup of Great Lakes Bantu. So it's you find it in Yoro, Toro, Ghana, Sogo as a productive reciprocal marker. It's attested in Yao, P21, also in Dengeleko, P11 as a productive reciprocal marker. You find it in Lamba, M54, though mentions it in its 1938 grammar. So it's widespread in East Bantu. You also find it in West Coastal Bantu as a Laman calls it a semi-reciprocal verb. So verbs formed by adding suffix angan to the primary stem of the verb. They express that one of the parts of the action is active while the other is indifferent. So approaching, to stick fast. So this you have this middle reciprocal meanings. The same in Tandu, Dalman calls it alterative, but it's a middle meaning. And interestingly, in Tiene, so it's a B80 language, so it's one of these West Coastal Bantu languages, not belonging to the Kikongo language cluster, where generally derivational morphology has disappeared. There are traces of, and Nari has proposed that for Tiene, so Neng would be a trace, a remnant of a non-compositional Angan sequence as a marker of reciprocity. But it's no longer productive in Tiene, but you still find it as a lexicalized traces, indicating that also within West Coastal Bantu, Angan must be quite old as a reciprocal, non-compositional reciprocal suffix. So here again, widespread across Bantu, non-compositional meanings, N is missing, belonging to the widest semantic domain of the middle, most prominently with reciprocity, but with a tendency towards intensity, reflecting the component An. Also attested in several major branches, and there I would say narrow, it's also in Central West Bantu. Hillstart has it in his Mongol grammar, but as Mark told, he has everything. So he was too much influenced by Proto-Bantu when describing Mongol, but so it's also there. So it's everywhere except in the Northwest. I didn't find any attestations in the Northwest. So is this something that can be reconstructed to Proto-Narrow Bantu minus Northwest? So Proto-Narrow Bantu, so that's nodes 3, or I don't know how many in our tree of Groenwood until 2015. So this one, unlike causative plus reciprocal, maybe there isn't a non-compositional Angan which can be reconstructed as a non-compositional compound suffix conveying reciprocity or a closely related meaning as one innovation, a morphological innovation deeper into Bantu, not as parallel innovations, but then as it's missing in the Northwest, probably not up to Proto-Bantu, including the Northwest. So no reason to change Leucis's Proto-Bantu, except if we say that Leucis's Proto-Bantu is rather Proto-Narrow Bantu than Proto-Bantu, including the Northwest. But this had been covered largely by Sebastian. So what does this tell us about the diachronic semantics of an itself, which actually occurs or as the final element of many of these compound extensions? As we have shown it in our article with Sebastian and Guillaume in 2015, an is very polysemic across Bantu. These are all the different meanings attested. One is dissociative, collective, doing things together as natural reciprocal. So even in Uganda, where agan is the productive suffix, you find still a simplex an extensions which are lexicalized. Chaining verbs like in Lingala, tutan, it's bump into each other. Anti-passive, that was the main subject of our paper, like in Kirundi, student insulted people, but so it's the transitivizing verb where the object is omitted. Intensive, extensive, like in Mongol, follow thoroughly, follow intensively. Iterative, closely related, these are these more inflectional meanings. And as Sarah mentioned, also in language like Douala, it has a function that closely resembles some of the functions which are more often associated with eat applicative it's an instrumental. So in Douala, he uses its tail to chase away mosquitoes, bolan ne pangane, so it's instrumental use of an. So mapped on, we've mapped this on the semantic, or plotted this on semantic map of the middle by camera, an adaptive version, so it covers quite a broad range of this semantic domain across Bantu. So, and as for the diachronic semantic reconstruction of an, what we have proposed is that an is maybe not so much a specific reciprocal marker or an associative marker in Proto-Bantu, but that it covers the more wider meaning of plurality of relations as defined by Lichten back in 2000. So plurality of relations which could be subdivided on the one hand in plurality of participants, which would then lead to meanings like reciprocal, collective, chaining, which are normally associated with an, but on the other hand, plurality of events in which, under which meanings like the intensive, iterative, habitual would be categorized, but then the anti-passive would then be an evolution of plurality of participants, but with the loss of plurality. The middle, plurality of the events with the loss of plurality. The question is then where would the instrumental come in this? This is not very clear. And if we reconstruct, if we try to do semantic reconstruction for Proto-Bantu, and then be primarily a marker of plurality of participants, and from there over through the overarching element of plurality of relations become a plurality of events marker, or would you rather say in Proto-Bantu it was a marker of plurality of relations and it then evolved into plurality of participants and plurality of events, I would say. Very hard to decide, but there are options. Thanks a lot.
Yes, do we have any questions? We do. Dimitri?
I have one kind of general concern / questions / remark. So these morphemes, they function like they are suffixes now synchronically in most of these languages. But why I was sure that they're not, I mean, they're still, what is their morphological status at the proto stage? I will just try to explain what I mean. When we look at the languages with maximality constraints in the Northwest mostly, so there are, first we have suffixes like elements like this an, reciprocal, and ac, final, which can often add an extra syllable. So above, on top of the maximality constraint, which kind of suggests that they are more like stems, or at least they used to be stems until relatively recently. So that this is possible. So on the second example, also about A7 languages like this passive suffix ban, for instance, like in the tone, there are certain things about it that shows that it's at least until relatively recently, it must have been a stem on its own, prosodically more or less independent from the verb. First, there is usually no deletion of this B in eban, in a tone. It can also be sometimes lengthened, which is typical for stem initial consonants. And it can also add a syllable, but at least maybe because it's also is containing this So this kind of indicates that at least these elements, they were until, I mean, definitely at the post-Proto-Bantu stage, there were still more or less independent morphological units. They were not suffixes. They were maybe clitics, but definitely not suffixes.
Like if in ban.
Ban. So I mean, for instance, for ban, what we can propose is this ban comes from ba, to become, which is maybe an option.
So that you would say it's an auxiliary verb plus an.
Yes, maybe. So, but just there's this indication in languages with maximality constraints that some of these elements, they used to be prosodically more independent than they are now until relatively recently. So they were not suffixes, but they were maybe clitics, maybe completely free words.
So the fact you still have like polysyllabic suffixes in those languages would be an indication that they are actually, that they have recently been integrated into the...
This is one of the things, plus, as I said, for instance, for this ban suffix, is that this consonant B in this particular element behaves more like stem initial consonants phonetically. So it doesn't undergo deletion, and it can be lengthened as stem initial consonants in the tone do.
Thank you. Larry has a comment or question.
This was really great. I have a lot of questions here. I want to point out just very quickly that Mason's brief statement about the order was slightly different from Cart because he put the reciprocal first before the applicative. And I'm being very puzzled by that. But I'm very puzzled by lots of things here. Maybe also what Gina just brought up, that the is, on the one hand, everyone, so many people say it comes from na, that makes it sound like fairly recent, but it's really deeply, embedded in these things, these very things you showed us. And even what Roger showed us, if that is correct too, is the second element there, that it seems to have a long history of being in Bantu. And so maybe that's just the stability of na that we can still identify it, I don't know. But I'm going to add to this, the problem, I think, is for me, I had this with the odd part. Yesterday, I showed an example from Busoga where it's agan, whereas normally the pre-initial is late, but this it's early. And if that's the same thing as the proactional one, there seems to be this an, there's ag, there's ak. It's lots of variations. It's really a mess with what exactly it is. But what's happened there, and this kind of maybe correlates with what Dina just said, is that the inflectional mark in the final vowel inflectional stuff, the A, the subjunctive, and the ire, can both precede and follow gan. It's as if there's a reanalysis, like feeling that gan is really like the second root. And that also shows up in the reduplication. In Luganda, I just recently discovered that when you reduplicate the verb stem, if it ends in agana, you can just, instead of reduplicating the whole thing, as you normally do, You can go like labagana to see each other. You can go labagana gana. But normally with any other extensions, you have to just do the whole thing. So there's something really special and identifiable and manipulable about these things, these combinations, it seems to me, that give them a life of their own.
Yeah, but the question is if then this is a trace of an older compound status or whether it's a reanalysis.
But I think it's a reanalysis, but the fact is it's heavy. Once you start getting these things that join together like that, they have a life of their own. And it seems, I was just also looking at the Lusoga, maybe 3,000 birds from Mina or whatever, and discovering some of the same sequences that you have over the West in there too. The one I was looking at was Angula, and things ending with Angu, because that's where you started. That kind of thing. Those exist. There aren't huge numbers, but there's some that exist there too. But there's some puzzling things. And the order is wrong in a way. The depth of the thing is wrong, and you wonder how many different things are we really dealing with here in terms of this ang or ag or is because in the languages where it does mark habitual, it's way off. Where imperfective and all that, like vega and so forth. It's way at the end, the so-called prefinal. But in these guys, it's way inside. So, I know you didn't have enough problems. I don't have yeah.
Anybody else? If not, we take a brief break in terms of coffee, and then we move to the other building just like yesterday for a wrap-up. And you have to stay because that is followed by a quiz, and there are prizes to be won. Proto prizes. See you there.